stunk 30 to that wall, so. So good morning, everyone, and again, thank you so much for having me. To start off, we are going to play a little word association. So when I say a phrase, I want you to just shout the first thing that comes to mind. Whatever comes to your head, pops into your head, just say it out loud. Peanut butter. Humpty Dumpty. Say out loud the first thing that comes to mind when you think about someone dunking a basketball. Now for the next two, I want you to think quietly in your head, don't say it out loud. A terrorist. A lesbian. So we certainly went from easy to a little more challenging and uncomfortable there. But what we did this exercise to highlight a key point that will be peppered throughout this talk, and a key point when we talk about social justice, the way that we have all been socialized in this society. When I first learned about this concept, it was like a great weight was lifted off my shoulders. Because it told me, like, yes, I do have biases. Yes, I do have prejudices. But they are not all my fault. And they are not all your fault either. So think about the Humpty Dumpty example. Think about what is the image of Humpty Dumpty. What is Humpty Dumpty? An egg, right? Now if you run through your head that nursery rhyme, nowhere in it does he say that Humpty Dumpty is an egg. But we were all socialized to understand that Humpty Dumpty was an egg based on what some illustrator chose to put down on paper as art. Next, think about that basketball example. Depending on how old you are, you might have said Dr. J, Michael Jordan. Personally, I'm a Vince Carter guy, or if you are younger, maybe someone like Jai Moran. Did anyone think of a woman? So there was this fascinating study done about girls' basketball, and the premise of this study was that girls aren't taught the skill of dunking a basketball because society has been socialized to think that they just can't do it. But what would happen if we explicitly taught this skill? And that was the premise of this study. And it found, through practice and training, that girls were just as capable as boys at dunking, given that very important variable of height, which I don't have, so I will never be dunking a basketball. So when I said terrorist, and someone who looks Middle Eastern came to your mind, I will tell you that it is not all your fault. It is also the way that you've been socialized. Even when I was writing this speech, writing down these words, as I was typing these words, I found myself thinking of someone who looks like they're from the Middle East. I was in 9th grade when 9/11 happened, and after, we know that there was a myriad of anti-Muslim, anti-Middle Eastern hate that was happening after that. And then, of course, the TV show 24 came out for the first time that October. And in that show, the villains are almost exclusively people who look like they're from the Middle East. And then when I thought lesbian, immediately, Ellen DeGeneres popped into my head, and Rosie O'Donnell, because of the way I was socialized. So now think way back to the day that you were born. I'm sure we all remember it. But when we are born, we're actually born without any of these biases, any of these prejudices. We are a blank slate. We are a tabula rasa. We know how to breathe, and we know how to cry, and that's about it. But we immediately begin to be socialized in this world. So quickly, in fact, that babies, another research study, babies as young as 6 months old can already distinguish between black and white dolls. And as early as 18 months, toddlers begin assigning positive or negative traits to black and white dolls. 18 months. And heartbreakingly, because again of society and what we are telling and learning and teaching, even black toddlers begin assigning negative traits to black dolls at this young age. We learn from the people who love us, who take care of us, who are our caregivers, and we unconsciously begin to trust those people, and we learn from them. We learn their habits. So if you were raised on peanut butter and fluff, or peanut butter and banana, perhaps you said that instead of jelly. I also heard yum, so that was a nice association. We also very quickly begin to be socialized not only by our loved ones, but by the world around us. I already talked about the TV show 24. We're socialized by TV, we're socialized by mass media, by our educational institutions, by our religious institutions, etc. And at every single one of those institutions, the reality is, rooted in its history of all those institutions, that it is white, heterosexual, Christian, cisgendered men who are seen as the ideal. Seen as what we call the dominant culture. My own children, who are 3 and 5, are already being socialized by the world around them despite all of my family's best interests. I was very excited when I first watched Star Wars with my oldest son, Dylan. And yes, I know he is too old to watch Star Wars. But the point is that one day we were in the grocery store and he pointed to a black man and he clutched my leg and he said, "Scary." When I asked him why, he said, "Darth Vader." Even at that age, he was able to associate just the color of the villain in a movie to someone else in public. Thankfully, we were able to quickly eliminate that act of discrimination and that prejudice because young minds are much easier to mold a little bit. Another story is that my boys love wearing dresses. They put them on and immediately they begin twirling around and they love the freedom and the air and all of that, and it's very adorable. But one day, Dylan suddenly didn't want to wear one to school anymore. It was because some of the kids were laughing at him. He was 3 at the time, and at 3 years old, his classmates already knew that boys do not wear dresses and that it is a silly thing to do and it's something to laugh at. Obviously, I don't blame a 3-year-old, and nothing malicious happened. They were just giggling, they called him silly, things like that. And I don't blame the teacher either, because the teacher also tried. But despite everyone's best efforts, Dylan now won't wear a dress to school anymore. And that's okay, because just as much as we are socialized in this world, we also learn how to survive. We learn how to survive in this world that does favor white, Christian, cishet men. And as we learn how to survive and we learn about what is the dominant culture and how to work in it, we can also unlearn. We can unlearn biases and we can unlearn prejudices. I learned how to survive as a Korean raised in a white community. As an adoptee, my life began with loss. Right from my birth, I was an orphan, and I immediately began learning how to survive. I was raised in a South Philly Italian family, and I didn't have an Asian classmate until junior year of high school. And now I know much more about pasta shapes than Korean food. And all that time, I did everything I could to assimilate into white culture and do what whiteness expected of me. A box was given to me, culture society told me to fit into that box, and I did everything I could to do that. I first realized that I was Asian and not white in first grade, when my classmates started playing a game called Get the Chink. They jumped me, as first graders do, no harm was done, they're not exactly strong. But I did have to kick and scream my way out of that situation. And when I told the teacher, the person I was supposed to trust, she just said, "Go play." We all have very formative memories in our past that are kind of just tattooed into our brain. This is one for me. It's one of my few elementary school memories. Mrs. Bunner in a red pantsuit on that blacktop telling me to just go play. I hated myself. I took advanced math classes because that's what was expected of me. I explicitly said I wouldn't date Asian girls, and I thought an 8 a.m. calculus class was smart when I started college. I did drop that class. I used humor to deflect and was always self-deprecating. And it wasn't until I started learning about racism in America and unlearning my own socialization that I began loving myself for what I was born with. And it was also learning about Martin Luther and the Reformation that I began to understand that we do not have to fit in the box that society hands us. We are able to question the world that we are expected to participate in. I was a teacher for 10 years, and I do credit Martin Luther as the reason why I became a teacher, so that I could teach young people that they too are allowed to think critically about the world. So let's take a quick moment to do another exercise. So out loud, I want you to say the word shop 10 times as fast as you can. Go. What do you do at a green light? So, psychologists smarter than me say that 95% of our cognitive function is unconscious. And that was just an example right there of your unconscious brain working. Our brains make shortcuts because it has to. If we didn't have an automatic brain, we would never be able to function. If I ask you to think about a person, just think about a person, can you do it without assigning a gender to that person? I doubt you can, because we have all been socialized to the point it becomes muscle memory to automatically assign gendered characteristics to people. And that is not a bad thing. Again, I don't blame one person for this. Is the way our brains work. We would not be able to move about the world unless we had an automatic brain. I don't blame one person for this internalized racism that I still work through to this day. I blame the society that we were raised in. I blame our socialization. Stuart Scott, the old Sports Center analyst, rest in peace, he's always said, don't hate the player, hate the game. In this case, I'm not hating the player, which is ourselves as individuals. My focus is on the system, on that system of racism and white supremacy. So thanks to Martin Luther and therapy and learning about systemic racism, I was finally learning to love who I was. I was doing great, and then I had this conversation that rocked my world. Similar to my first grade bullying experience, I remember every detail of this moment. Sophomore year, Penn State, we were eating lunch at the deli with my friend, a woman named Alyssa. I made a sexist joke that I'm not going to repeat because it should not be told in a church. And Alyssa told me about myself. She told me about the toxic masculinity that I was exuding and the privilege that I carry in this world as a man. But she did so in a way that was compassionate. It was loving, not in the narrow definition that we have in our society, but loving in a radical way because it was exactly what I needed to hear at that moment. This began a series of conversations about feminism and feminist theory and patriarchy, and of course, Alyssa has no recollection of this conversation at all. She thinks I made it up. I've told this story 100 times, I'm sure it happened, but it just illustrates that point of what a single small conversation can have when we speak up about oppression, when we think about the idea of seeing something and saying something. I realized that even though I felt the burden of a society that benefits whiteness and not me as a Korean, my maleness gave me many more benefits that I had no idea about at that time. And every single one of us in this room simultaneously have had to learn to survive because of a piece of their identity, but also have unearned privilege because of a different part of their identity. You might be white and have that privilege, but maybe your parents struggled to put food on the table, and you were oppressed by class. Maybe you were the first person in your family to go to college. Maybe you were oppressed by patriarchy as a woman, but you've never had to worry about the government telling you who you can marry because you're heterosexual. We all contain these multitudes and nuances, and it's what makes us human. If we are able to understand the shared humanity in each other and approach each other with the kind of compassion and radical love that my friend Alyssa once showed me, And if we can be open to growth and unlearning, our world is going to be a better place. I understood my place in the world as a man because I could empathize and translate with my place in the world as a racialized person. And again, we all possess biases and prejudices, but what matters is our ability to identify them and work to eliminate the negative ones, to unlearn what we have learned. This congregation becoming an officially open and affirming place is part of that growth. It is an understanding of the shared humanity, it is an understanding and commitment to both grow as individuals and as an institution. Right now in this county, there are countless people in power who are trying to strip people of their individual humanity and force people to assimilate into that dominant culture. And we do have to fight back, but we have to fight back with compassion and radical love for the people who are being most affected. If you follow local news, you will know that our local school boards have become places where we see some of the worst sides in people. But we cannot fight back using the same type of rhetoric, because it is only going to cause further division. We can't fight individuals individually. We have to do it as a community. We actually had a big win for queer inclusion in Manheim Township last Thursday night. The school board member was trying to get the board to formally begin discussing whether or not we should discriminate against our transgender community. And yes, we did see a few dozen community members make public comments that lacked compassion, that refused to see the humanity of our transgender community. But again, I don't blame them. I do blame the society and how they were socialized. So we chose a strategy that centered on understanding and empathy rather than trying to meet them at the microphone and argue point by point with facts. We embarked on an email campaign to the board that focused on many of the things that I talked about today, that yes, perhaps as cisgendered people, we too did not understand what it meant to be transgender. But then we learned, and we unlearned, and we grew, and now we know better. And we implored the board to learn very quickly, actually. We focused on compassion and understanding and radical love, and at the same time we made sure to center the needs of our most vulnerable, in this case our transgender students. We listened to them, we made sure that their points were heard, and we also said you don't need to show up, because it's not going to be a very nice place in that room, hearing from members of the community who are supposed to care about each other, say things that would be actively harmful to them. And we won for now. The board decided not to have the conversation until federal guidelines are provided, and we don't anticipate forgetting those for 2 years, because we know how slow the federal government works sometimes. And we got 2 Republicans to break party lines, and they chose compassion over politics. And my last point on socialization is that we have been socialized to believe that it is individuals that have made great change. That it was Rosa Parks, and then it was Martin Luther King, and then Barack Obama, and then racism was done. But what this does is it keeps people on the sideline. It keeps people thinking that we're stuck. What can I do? We're just stuck with where we are. But behind every great individual, there is a community of people who had a role to play. I noticed that you have your Thanksgiving food drive in the bulletin. I know that I would not be the one to be organizing the food, but I certainly know that I can buy a load of groceries. We all have a part to play. It was an army of people who executed that Montgomery bus boycott, and it was a very intentional strategy to choose Rosa Parks as a catalyst. And yes, MLK was perhaps the most brilliant orator of our time, of the 20th century, perhaps ever. But I would never ask him to plan a birthday party, because he was very bad at organizing logistics. But it was Barry Rustin, Ella Baker, and others who helped strategize and plan, and it was people who executed that strategy and won, not an individual. People disagreed and they fought, but they shared core values that allowed them to see the humanity in each other and continue to work towards justice, even if they sometimes disagreed what that strategy looked like. There are going to be many losses in the future for justice, but we have to make sure that we know where our community is. because it takes a community to achieve justice. When we lose, we have to have a community to fall back on. We have to have our people. We have to have faith, and we have to have hope. Every single one of you has a role to play, no matter how large or small society deems it. If it is moving towards justice, then it is progress, and if it is progress, then it is moving towards justice. I encourage every single one of you to think about what brings you joy, what our community needs, and what your own strengths are, and work in that intersection. Build your community and take that step into action because we need you. So thank you for inviting me into your community. And one final exercise. Again, you've done this before. Let's see if you can do better this time. I want you to say joke as fast as you can 10 times. Go. What's the white part of an egg called? Thank you, everyone.